The bronze gates of Troy had stood unbreached for 9 years. 9 years of Greek blood soaking into the Trojan plain. 9 years of funeral pyres sending smoke into the Mediterranean sky. 9 years of stalemate that had transformed eager warriors into exhausted veterans who could barely remember why they were fighting. But on this morning, as Apollo's chariot climbed above the eastern horizon, everything would change. The Scaean gates, those massive bronze-plated barriers that had mocked the Greek army since the first day of siege, would finally swing open. And when they did, the Trojan defenders would learn what it meant to face the full fury of Greek hoplites, fighting not as individuals, but as a single unstoppable machine of bronze and iron. The story begins not on that final day, but in the council tent of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and commander of the Greek forces 3 days earlier. The greatest warriors of Greece sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by flickering oil lamps, their eyes hollow from years of frustration. Achilles, the greatest warrior the world had ever seen, had finally returned to battle after his rage over Patroclus' death had been satisfied with Hector's corpse dragged around the city walls. Odysseus, king of Ithaca and the craftiest mind in either army, sat quietly observing. Ajax the Great, massive and brutal, cleaned blood from beneath his fingernails. Diomedes, who had once wounded Ares himself in battle, sharpened his spear point with methodical precision. These were men who had killed hundreds, who had seen friends die in their arms, who had transformed from noble kings into instruments of war. Agamemnon stood at the centre, his face carved with lines that hadn't existed when the fleet first landed on these shores. "We cannot continue this way," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 9 years of failure. "We lose men daily to Trojan arrows from the walls. Our supplies dwindle. Our allies grow restless. The men speak of abandoning the siege, of returning home with nothing to show for a decade of bloodshed. Some suggest we've angered the gods, that Helen was never meant to be recovered, that Paris's theft of Menelaus's wife was ordained by divine will we cannot overcome." The tent fell silent. Every man present knew the truth that none wanted to speak. The Trojans had won the war of attrition. Their walls were impregnable. Their king, Priam, had ruled wisely, maintaining supplies through trade routes the Greeks could never fully blockade. The death of Hector, Troy's greatest defender, had barely slowed the city's resistance. New champions had risen. The Trojan people, fighting for their homes and families, possessed a determination that mercenary Greeks fighting for another man's wife could never match. Odysseus broke the silence with words that would change everything. "We have been fighting this war wrong from the beginning. We came here as individuals, as champions seeking glory. Achilles hunts Hector. Ajax challenges their warriors to single combat. We fight as our fathers fought, as heroes seeking to have our names sung by poets. But while we pursue individual glory, the Trojans fight as a people, defending every inch of their walls together. What if we abandoned the old ways? What if we fought not as heroes, but as a single unit?" The other kings stared at Odysseus as if he'd suggested sacrificing their own children. Diomedes was the first to speak, his voice dripping with contempt. "You want us to abandon honour? To fight like common foot soldiers rather than nobles? My lineage traces back to the gods themselves. I will not skulk in formation like a peasant farmer conscripted into service." But Achilles, surprisingly, leaned forward with interest. "Explain yourself, Ithacan. How would this formation fighting defeat walls our siege engines cannot breach?" Odysseus stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through a plan he'd been developing for months. The Trojans will not remain behind their walls forever. Their food supplies, while better than ours, are not infinite. Already, I've received reports from our scouts that foraging parties venture out at dawn to gather grain from hidden stores in the countryside. They've grown bold, believing we're too demoralized to mount effective attacks. What if we feigned retreat? What if we made it appear that the Greek army is finally abandoning the siege? We load our ships, we pull back our camps, we sail our fleet beyond the horizon. The Trojans will believe the war is over. They'll open their gates. They'll flood onto the plain to celebrate, to reclaim the fields we've occupied for a decade. And that's when we strike." Agamemnon shook his head. "We've tried ambushes before. The Trojans aren't fools. They'll send scouts. They'll ensure it's not a trap before venturing beyond arrow range of their walls." "Which is why we must truly leave," Odysseus continued. We sail away, completely out of sight. We leave behind only a token force, perhaps 200 men, hidden in the reeds by the Scamander River. But these won't be our champions fighting individually. These will be men fighting in a formation I learned about from Egyptian traders, a tactic they claim the Spartans have been perfecting in their mountain valleys. We lock our shields together, we fight as one body with many spears, and we hold a position against superior numbers not through individual skill but through collective discipline. Ajax laughed, a harsh bark that echoed through the tent. 200 men in formation against thousands of Trojans. You've lost your mind, Odysseus. We'd be slaughtered. Not if the formation holds, Odysseus insisted, not if every man trusts the man beside him. Not if we abandon the idea that battle glory comes from individual kills and embrace the idea that glory comes from the unit's victory. The Egyptians call it fighting in the phalanx. Shield beside shield, spear beside spear, each man protecting his neighbour, the formation moving as one entity. It requires discipline beyond anything we've practiced, but I believe it could work. Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the Greek kings, spoke up for the first time, his ancient voice cutting through the debate. I fought beside soldiers who used similar tactics in my youth, during the war against the centaurs. It was devastatingly effective, but it required trust beyond normal brotherhood. Each man must believe that his neighbour will hold the line, that no one will break and run, that the formation is more important than any individual life. These are Greek kings and nobles you're asking to fight like common soldiers. Then we use common soldiers, Achilles said suddenly, his voice sharp with decision. We take the best spearmen from each contingent, not the nobles and champions, but the veteran foot soldiers who fought for 9 years without seeking glory or recognition. We train them in this phalanx formation, and when the Trojans emerge onto the plain, believing they've won, these men will show them what disciplined warfare can accomplish. The plan was audacious and desperate, the product of 9 years of failure forcing proud kings to consider tactics they would have scorned at the war's beginning. But desperation had made them pragmatic. Over the next 3 days, while the main Greek army made elaborate preparations to abandon the siege, 200 veteran spearmen from across the Greek contingents gathered in secret in the marshes along the Scamander River. These were not the celebrated heroes whose names would live in legend. They were professional soldiers who'd survived 9 years of warfare through skill and caution, rather than reckless courage. The man chosen to lead them was Stichius of Sparta, a veteran commander who'd trained the Spartan contingent and had been advocating for formation tactics since the war's 3rd year. Stichius was in his 40s, ancient by the standards of warriors who typically died young. His face was a map of scar tissue. His body bore wounds from a dozen battles, but his mind was sharp and his understanding of collective tactics was unmatched in the Greek army. Stichius gathered his 200 men in a hidden grove and addressed them with brutal honesty. Everything you've learned about fighting in this war is wrong. You've been trained to seek individual glory, to break formation and pursue fleeing enemies, to challenge opponents to single combat. Forget all of it. In the phalanx, your glory is the man beside you surviving. Your victory is the formation holding. Your honor is trusting your shield brother to protect your exposed side while you protect his. I'm going to train you to move as one body, to thrust as one weapon, to hold ground that common sense says cannot be held. The training was brutal and brief. 3 days to transform individualistic warriors into a coordinated unit was impossibly short, but these men were veterans who learned quickly. Stichius drilled them relentlessly in the basics. Shield overlapping shield on the left side, creating an unbroken bronze wall. Spears held overhand, thrusting over the shield wall in coordinated strikes. The front rank holding position absolutely. The rear ranks pushing forward to maintain pressure and replace fallen front fighters. Step together, thrust together, hold together. The individual means nothing. The phalanx is everything. The most difficult lesson was psychological. Warriors are trained from childhood to seek glory through individual achievement. The Homeric tradition celebrated champions who broke from formation to pursue great deeds. But phalanx warfare required the opposite, absolute suppression of individual initiative in favour of collective discipline. It required men to stand firm while enemies approached rather than charging forward. It required warriors to hold position when every instinct screamed to pursue a fleeing enemy. It required a level of trust that most warriors never developed, the absolute faith that the man beside you would not break and expose your vulnerable side. Meanwhile, the main Greek army executed the most elaborate deception in military history. The entire fleet began loading supplies and equipment. Camps were struck. Siege engines were dismantled. To any observer on Troy's walls, it appeared the Greeks were finally abandoning their futile siege. Agamemnon made a great show of sacrificing to Poseidon, asking the sea god for safe passage home and forgiveness for having failed to take Troy despite a decade of effort. The beaches that had been covered with Greek camps and equipment for 9 years were systematically cleared. Inside Troy, the mood transformed from cautious optimism to euphoric celebration. King Priam addressed his people from the walls, his ancient voice shaking with emotion. "The gods have delivered us. Our endurance has broken the Greek resolve. Our sacrifice has been rewarded. Hector did not die in vain. Paris's choice, however controversial, has been vindicated. Troy stands undefeated. We have survived the greatest military force ever assembled against a single city, and we have won." The Trojan people poured into their streets in celebration. Wine flowed freely. Prayers and sacrifices to the gods filled every temple. Young men who'd known nothing but war their entire adult lives wept with relief. Mothers whose sons had died defending the walls felt their sacrifices had meaning. After 9 years of constant vigilance, of never knowing whether each dawn would bring fresh Greek assaults, the Trojans allowed themselves to believe the nightmare had ended. But Priam's advisors urged caution. Antenor, one of Troy's wisest counsellors, advocated for maintaining vigilance even as the Greek fleet disappeared over the horizon. "The Greeks are cunning, Odysseus especially. We should wait. Ensure this is not an elaborate trap. Keep the gates closed. Maintain our defences. A few more weeks of caution after 9 years of war seems a small price for certainty." However, pragmatic concerns overrode caution. Troy's food supplies, while adequate, were not infinite. 9 years of siege had depleted the fields around the city. Stored grain from secret caches outside the walls needed to be retrieved. Livestock had been consumed or slaughtered. The city needed to resume normal agricultural activity or face starvation within months. Additionally, the psychological need for the Trojan people to reclaim their fields, to prove the siege had truly ended, was overwhelming. On the 3rd day after the last Greek ship had disappeared over the horizon, with scouts reporting the beaches completely abandoned and no sign of Greek forces within a day's march of Troy, Priam gave the order to open the gates. The celebration that erupted was unlike anything Troy had experienced. Thousands of citizens poured through the Achaean gates onto the Trojan plain for the first time in 9 years. Farmers rushed to inspect their fields. Young people who'd been children when the war started saw the countryside beyond their walls for the first time in their conscious memory. Soldiers, still cautious, spread out to ensure no Greek forces remained hidden in the area. By noon, the Trojan plain was filled with thousands of civilians and soldiers, all celebrating their unlikely victory. The mood was festive, almost dreamlike. Children ran through fields they'd only heard about in stories. Women gathered wildflowers. Men assessed which fields could be quickly planted to ensure winter stores. The Achaean gate stood wide open, with only a token guard remaining, most of Troy's military having ventured onto the plain to establish security perimeters and ensure the Greek departure was genuine. Hidden in the marshes along the Scamander River, 200 Greek hoplites watched and waited. They'd been in position for 3 days, living in absolute silence in the marsh reeds, eating cold rations, not daring to light fires or make any sound that might alert Trojan scouts. Stichius had positioned them carefully, studying the terrain and calculating exactly where the Trojans would be most vulnerable. The marsh was roughly half a mile from the Achaean gates, separated by open ground that sloped gently upward toward Troy's walls. Stichius's plan was simple, but required perfect timing. The phalanx would emerge from the marsh and advance at steady pace toward the gates. The Trojans, seeing only 200 men, would initially assume it was a small force left behind, easily dealt with. By the time they realized the Greeks were advancing in an unfamiliar formation, with specific tactical intent, the phalanx would be close enough to the gates that the Trojans couldn't fully close them, without abandoning thousands of their people still outside the walls. The signal came when a Trojan scouting party passed within yards of their hiding position, without detecting them. These scouts, confident the Greeks had truly departed, were careless in their inspection, more interested in celebrating than thorough reconnaissance. Once they passed, Stichius gave the order with a single sharp whistle. 200 men rose from the marsh like bronze ghosts, water streaming from their armour, shields locked together before their bodies were fully upright, spears held at ready. Not a word was spoken. They'd trained for this moment for 3 days, and every man knew his position, his role, his responsibility to the formation. The phalanx emerged from the marsh in 8 ranks of 25 men each. The formation was 25 shields wide and 8 men deep, creating a rectangular block of bronze and iron that began advancing toward Troy at a steady walking pace. The shields were large, roughly 3 feet in diameter, made of bronze-faced wood that overlapped to create an unbroken wall. Each man's shield protected not only himself, but the right side of the man to his left, creating a mutual dependency that was the phalanx's greatest strength and vulnerability. If any man broke and ran, he exposed his neighbour. The formation's power came from absolute cohesion. The first Trojans to notice the advancing Greeks were farmers working fields about halfway between the marsh and the city gates. Their initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Only 200 men, advancing slowly in tight formation, didn't seem like a serious threat. Some laughed, pointing out the odd way these Greeks moved, locked together like they were playing some child's game. A few shouted warnings toward the gates, but without urgency. Inside Troy, the mood shifted rapidly from confusion to concern to alarm as more people noticed the advancing formation. Veteran soldiers studying the disciplined advance realized this was something new. The Greeks weren't charging recklessly or spreading out for individual combat. They were advancing with mechanical precision, maintaining perfect formation, their pace steady and implacable. Alarm bells began ringing from the walls. Trojan soldiers scattered across the plain started rushing back toward the gates, while military commanders tried to organize a response. Polydamas, one of Troy's most experienced commanders who had survived countless battles over 9 years, quickly assessed the situation from his position near the gates. The Greeks numbered only 200 against thousands of Trojans on the plain, and many more inside the city. He could easily gather a force to overwhelm them, but something about the formation worried him. He'd never seen Greeks fight this way, had never encountered shields locked together in an unbroken wall with spears protruding like the quills of a monstrous hedgehog. His instinct was to close the gates immediately, but thousands of Trojan civilians were still outside, some nearly a mile away. Closing the gates meant abandoning his own people to Greek spears. Polydamas made the decision that Stichius had anticipated. He would organize the Trojan warriors on the plain, gather them into a force that outnumbered the Greeks 10-1, and crush this impudent formation before it reached the gates. He sent runners to gather all soldiers scattered across the plain, and began organizing the warriors near the gates into a counter-attacking force. Within minutes, nearly 800 Trojan warriors had assembled, far outnumbering the Greek phalanx. They formed up in the traditional manner, loose groups of warriors with their champions at the front, prepared to charge and overwhelm the Greeks through sheer numbers and individual prowess. The two forces approached each other across the Trojan plain under the afternoon sun. The Trojans advanced with confident swagger, warriors calling out challenges and boasts, certain that numbers would prevail. The Greek phalanx moved in eerie silence, only the rhythmic sound of 200 men stepping in perfect unison, their bronze armour creaking in harmony, their shields bumping together with each step creating a sound like distant thunder. No war cries, no individual boasting, just mechanical, relentless advance. At 100 yards, Polydamas halted the Trojan force and addressed his men. "They're trying to scare us with formation discipline. Don't be intimidated. When we charge, their formation will break. No soldiers can maintain that tight cohesion once combat begins. We outnumber them 4-1. Stay together during the charge, hit them hard, and this will be over quickly. We'll have Greek heads on pikes outside the Scaean gates before sunset." At 50 yards, Stichius gave his first verbal command since emerging from the marsh. "Halt." The phalanx stopped as one, not a single man moving out of sync. Then, shields up. 200 shields rose in unison, creating an unbroken bronze wall 8 feet high and 25 men wide. Spears ready, 200 spear points, each 8 feet long, protruded through and over the shield wall, creating a bristling barrier of iron-tipped death. The front rank held their spears overhand, angled downward to strike attackers at chest height. The second and third ranks held theirs at different angles, creating multiple layers of spear points that made approaching the formation suicidal. Polydamas, studying the formation from horseback, felt his first real twinge of doubt. The shield wall was unbroken, the spears created overlapping zones of danger, and most importantly, not a single Greek soldier showed any sign of fear or hesitation. These weren't the glory-seeking champions Troy had fought for 9 years. These were professional soldiers executing a tactical plan with mechanical precision. But retreat was impossible. The Scaean gate stood open behind him with thousands of civilians streaming back toward the city. The Trojan warriors around him outnumbered the Greeks and expected victory. Any hesitation would be seen as cowardice. Polydamas raised his sword and gave the order to charge. 800 Trojan warriors surged forward with a roar that echoed off the city walls. They came in a mass. The traditional Bronze Age charge of individual warriors running together, each man planning to use his spear or sword to strike down enemies in personal combat. The fastest and most eager warriors pulled ahead of their comrades, creating a ragged line that would hit the Greek formation in waves rather than as a unified force. Stichius watched them come with cold calculation. Hold the line. Brace. Let them break themselves on our shields. Trust your brothers. The phalanx is everything. The first Trojan warriors reached the Greek formation at a full sprint and slammed into the shield wall like waves hitting a bronze cliff. The impact was tremendous. The sound of flesh and bronze colliding echoed across the plain. But the phalanx didn't break. The front rank had locked their shields and braced their feet, with the ranks behind them pushing forward to absorb the impact. When individual Trojan warriors hit the wall, they found not individual Greeks to fight, but an impenetrable barrier of overlapping shields backed by the weight of 200 men. The Greek spears began their work. As Trojans pressed against the shield wall, trying to find gaps or force their way through, the spear points thrust forward in coordinated strikes. Not wild individual attacks, but synchronized thrusts controlled by Stichius's shouted commands. Front rank, thrust. 8 feet of ashwood spear driven by trained arms punched through bronze chest plates, through leather armor, through flesh and bone. Withdraw. The spears pulled back in unison, already coated with blood. Second rank, thrust. A fresh row of spear points shot forward over the shields, striking Trojans who thought they'd evaded the first attack. This wasn't warfare as the Bronze Age understood it. This was systematic killing, mechanical and efficient. The Trojans in the front ranks died in horrifying numbers. Men who'd survived 9 years of individual combat found themselves facing a completely unfamiliar form of warfare. There was no enemy champion to challenge, no single warrior to focus on, just an unbroken wall of bronze from which spear points emerged with mechanical regularity. Warriors tried to strike at individual Greeks but found their blows absorbed by overlapping shields, while counter-thrusts from multiple angles found exposed flesh. The warrior's instinct to break formation and pursue individual glory became a death sentence. Any Trojan who pressed forward alone was immediately struck by multiple spears from different angles. Polydamas, watching in growing horror from behind the initial assault, saw his front ranks crumbling. Warriors were falling back with terrible wounds, spear thrusts through chests and throats and stomachs. The Greek formation hadn't wavered. Not a single shield had broken from the wall. Not a single Greek had stepped forward to pursue fleeing enemies. The phalanx simply held its position, spears thrusting in coordinated rhythm, killing anyone who came within range, then waiting patiently for the next attack. He tried to organize a flanking maneuver, sending warriors to attack the sides of the Greek formation where the phalanx would be more vulnerable. But Stichius had anticipated this. At his command, the phalanx's flanks shifted their shields and spears to create curved walls that extended backward, creating a shallow U-shape that made flanking attacks nearly as dangerous as frontal assault. Warriors trying to strike at the phalanx sides found themselves facing the same unbroken shield wall and coordinated spear thrusts that had devastated the center. The casualties mounted rapidly. Within 10 minutes of the first contact, nearly 100 Trojan warriors lay dead or dying in front of the Greek formation. The phalanx had lost exactly 3 men, all in the front rank, all immediately replaced by soldiers stepping forward from the second rank to fill the gaps. The shield wall never broke, the spear thrusts never paused, the mechanical rhythm of organised killing continued without variation. The psychological impact on the Trojans was devastating. These were warriors who understood courage in terms of individual bravery, who'd been raised on stories of heroes like Hector engaging in single combat, who measured their worth by personal deeds in battle. But there was no glory to be found fighting the phalanx, no champions to challenge, no individual enemies to overcome, just a bronze machine that killed efficiently and without emotion. Warriors who'd never shown fear in 9 years of war found themselves hesitating, looking for ways to avoid engaging the formation directly, their courage undermined by the complete futility of attacking the shield wall. Polydamas made the desperate decision to commit his entire force in one overwhelming charge. He gathered every warrior on the plain, nearly 800 men still combat effective, and prepared for a mass assault that would either break the Greek formation through sheer weight of numbers or die in the attempt. He positioned archers behind the main force to shoot over the charging warriors at the Greek formation, hoping arrow fire might break the cohesion even slightly. Stichius saw the preparation and gave new orders. Overhead shields. The rear 4 ranks of the phalanx raised their shields above their heads, creating a bronze roof over the formation. The front ranks maintained their wall, creating a box of bronze armour that arrows rattled off harmlessly. It was a manoeuvre they'd practiced hundreds of times in the marsh over the past 3 days, and it executed flawlessly. The Trojan arrows proved useless, bouncing off shields or finding tiny gaps but failing to break the formation's cohesion. When the archery barrage ended and Polydamas led the mass charge personally, the phalanx was ready. Stichius gave the order that would decide the battle. Advance. For the first time since emerging from the marsh, the Greek formation moved forward, stepping in perfect unison, shields locked, spears thrusting rhythmically. Instead of receiving the Trojan charge statically, the phalanx advanced into it, maintaining formation while moving, the mechanical precision of their coordination allowing them to fight and maneuver simultaneously. The advancing phalanx met the charging Trojans with catastrophic results. The Greeks weren't just holding ground anymore, they were pushing forward, their shields creating unstoppable momentum backed by 200 men moving as one. Trojans found themselves not just facing a defensive wall, but being actively pushed backward by an advancing bronze machine. Men who tried to stand and fight were trampled by the formation's advance or impaled by multiple spears. Warriors who fell in front of the phalanx were stepped over or on, crushed beneath the inexorable forward movement. The Trojan formation shattered. Individual warriors broke and ran, and once the collapse began it spread like a plague. Men who'd fought courageously for 9 years abandoned the field, fleeing toward the gates or scattering across the plain. The phalanx didn't pursue, it simply maintained its steady advance toward the Scaean gates, stepping over the bodies of fallen Trojans, the discipline holding even as enemies fled in every direction. Polydamas, wounded in the shoulder, and watching his entire command disintegrate, made the only decision left to him. He ordered the Scaean gates closed. Hundreds of Trojan civilians were still outside the walls, including women and children who'd ventured onto the plain to celebrate Troy's supposed victory. But the phalanx was now less than 300 yards from the gates and advancing steadily. If he kept them open any longer, the Greek formation would reach the gates themselves, and once inside the city, the confined streets would favour the Greeks' close quarters formation tactics. He had to sacrifice civilians outside to save the city itself. The massive bronze gates began to swing closed, operated by teams of men straining at the mechanisms. Trojan civilians, realizing they were being abandoned outside the walls, screamed and rushed toward the narrowing opening. The Greek phalanx saw the gates closing and finally broke formation discipline. Stichius gave the order to charge. 200 Greeks, no longer constrained by phalanx tactics, sprinted toward the closing gates. Some were trying to reach them before they shut completely. Others were cutting down fleeing Trojans. Still others were trying to kill or capture as many stranded civilians as possible to use as hostages. The Scaean gates slammed shut just as the first Greeks reached them. But the damage was done. Nearly 200 Trojan warriors lay dead on the plain, victims of the phalanx's mechanical killing efficiency. Hundreds more were wounded. Dozens of civilians had been cut off from the city, captured by Greeks who would use them as bargaining chips or hostages. And most importantly, Troy's psychological invincibility had been shattered. The city that had survived 9 years of siege had been humiliated in a single afternoon by 200 men using tactics the Bronze Age had never seen before. Inside Troy, the mood had transformed from celebration to panic. The civilians who'd poured onto the plain in the morning had rushed back through the gates in terror, bringing stories of Greeks who fought like bronze demons, of formations that couldn't be broken, of warriors who killed without glory or mercy. Polydamas made his report to King Priam, his voice hollow with defeat. "They fought in a way we've never encountered, my king, not as individuals seeking glory, but as a single unified force. Our numbers meant nothing. Our courage meant nothing. They simply stood their ground and killed everyone who approached them. I don't know how to fight such tactics." Outside the walls, the Greek phalanx reformed in perfect order, shields locked, spears ready, maintaining discipline even in victory. Sticius counted his losses: 15 men dead, 33 wounded. Against 800 Trojans, his formation had maintained a nearly 50-to-1 kill ratio. The tactic had worked beyond even his hopes. But the battle wasn't over. Within hours, signal fires appeared on the horizon. The Greek fleet, which had sailed just beyond visual range, was returning. Agamemnon had watched the entire battle from the deck of his flagship using signal flags from scouts positioned in the hills. The moment he saw the Trojan gates close prematurely and the phalanx victorious on the plain, he gave the order to return at full speed. By nightfall, the entire Greek army was back on the beaches, camps were being re-established, and siege lines were reformed around Troy. But everything had changed. The Greeks had discovered a new way of warfare that turned Troy's defensive advantages into liabilities. The Trojans, traumatized by their afternoon defeat, knew they now faced an enemy who'd learned to win through discipline and coordination, rather than individual heroics. The siege would continue, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Troy's invincibility had been broken by 200 men fighting not as heroes, but as a unified machine of disciplined violence. The age of champions engaging in individual combat was ending, replaced by an era of formation warfare where collective discipline defeated personal courage. The phalanx had spoken, and its message was written in Trojan blood across the plain before the Scaean gates. In the Greek camp that night, Sticius addressed his 200 survivors. "You won today not because you were the bravest warriors or the most skilled. You won because you trusted each other completely, because you made the phalanx more important than your individual lives, because you fought not for personal glory but for collective victory. Every army that learns this lesson will be unstoppable. Every army that clings to the old ways will die like the Trojans died today. You've shown the world a new form of warfare, and nothing will ever be the same. The Trojan War would end not with the famous wooden horse of later legends, but with Troy understanding that walls and courage weren't enough against enemies who'd mastered disciplined formation warfare. The day the Greek hoplites routed the Trojan defenders was the day the Bronze Age learned that the future belonged not to individual champions, but to unified formations of disciplined soldiers. The phalanx had proven its worth in Trojan blood, and every army that failed to adapt would face the same mechanical slaughter that had destroyed Polydamas's force in a single afternoon. The age of heroes was dying. The age of organized warfare had been born on the plain before Troy's gates. The morning after the phalanx's victory, Troy's walls were lined with citizens staring at the carnage scattered across the plain. Bodies of Trojan warriors lay where they'd fallen. Some clustered in piles where the phalanx had methodically cut them down, others scattered across hundreds of yards where they'd been struck down while fleeing. The Greeks made no effort to retrieve their own dead, or allow the Trojans to collect theirs. The corpses remained as a psychological weapon, a constant reminder visible from every vantage point in the city of what disciplined formation warfare could accomplish against traditional Bronze Age combat tactics. King Priam convened his war council in the great hall of his palace, but the usual confidence that had sustained Troy through 9 years of siege was absent. The commanders who assembled were shaken men who'd witnessed something that contradicted everything they understood about warfare. Antenor spoke first, his voice grave. "We cannot fight them in open battle anymore. The phalanx formation neutralizes every advantage we've developed. Our champions are useless against a shield wall. Our numbers mean nothing when they can kill 50 men for every Greek who falls. We must remain behind the walls and wait for disease or desertion to break the Greek army, as we've done for 9 years." But Aeneas, one of Troy's most capable commanders, and a voice the council respected, disagreed sharply. "We can't simply hide behind walls and hope the Greeks give up again. They've tasted victory now. They've found a way to defeat us that doesn't require breaching our fortifications. Every day we remain passive, their confidence grows while ours diminishes. We need to understand this phalanx tactic and develop countermeasures. We need to learn to fight the way they fight, or find weaknesses in their formation we can exploit." The debate raged for hours with no clear resolution. Some commanders advocated immediate counterattacks to prove Troy hadn't been broken psychologically. Others insisted on absolute defensive posture. A few suggested negotiating peace, returning Helen and accepting whatever terms the Greeks demanded. But this faction was shouted down by those who refused to surrender after surviving 9 years of siege. What none of them fully grasped yet was that the fundamental nature of warfare had changed overnight, and Troy's entire military doctrine had become obsolete. Outside the walls, the Greek camp buzzed with a different energy. Word of the phalanx's victory had spread through every contingent, and suddenly every commander wanted to train their men in the new formation tactics. Stichius found himself besieged by kings and captains demanding to learn the secrets of the shield wall, the coordinated spear thrusts, the psychological discipline required to hold formation against overwhelming numbers. Agamemnon, recognizing the transformative potential, ordered comprehensive training programs established immediately across the entire army. But Odysseus, ever the pragmatist, raised concerns that others had overlooked. The phalanx worked brilliantly in yesterday's battle because the Trojans didn't understand what they were facing. They charged straight into our shields expecting traditional combat. Now they've seen the formation. They know its strengths. Intelligent enemies will adapt. We need to understand the phalanx's weaknesses before the Trojans discover them and exploit them. Every tactic has vulnerabilities. We must find ours before our enemies do. Diomedes, who'd watched the battle from the Greek lines, identified the most obvious weakness. The formation is devastating when it can maintain cohesion on level ground against frontal attacks. But what happens on rough terrain where maintaining shield contact becomes difficult? What happens if they're attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing them to defend on several fronts? What happens against missiles, against sustained arrow fire from enemies who refuse to engage directly? The phalanx is powerful, but it's not invincible. The Trojans will figure this out. Achilles, surprisingly, became one of the formation's strongest advocates despite initial skepticism. "I've spent my entire life perfecting individual combat skills, seeking personal glory in battle. Everything I was taught said that the greatest warrior wins through superior technique and courage in single combat. But yesterday I watched 200 ordinary soldiers achieve a victory that I, with all my skill, couldn't accomplish alone. There's a different kind of glory in what they did. The glory of the unit, of brothers trusting each other absolutely, of victory achieved through cooperation rather than competition. Maybe the age of champions is ending, and maybe that's not entirely a bad thing." Over the following weeks, the Greek army transformed itself. Thousands of soldiers underwent intensive phalanx training, learning to move in coordination, to trust their shield brothers, to suppress individual initiative in favor of collective discipline. The training was brutal, both physically and psychologically. Warriors who'd spent years developing individual fighting techniques had to unlearn ingrained habits. Champions who measured their worth by personal kill counts had to accept that their value now came from holding formation and protecting their neighbours. Many struggled with the transition, their egos unable to accept subordination to the collective. The most effective phalanx units emerged not from the contingents led by the greatest champions but from armies with strong existing discipline and cohesion. The Spartan contingent, already trained in coordinated tactics, adapted quickest. The Mycenaean heavy infantry, accustomed to following orders precisely, became formidable phalanx fighters within weeks. The warriors from Ithaca, trained by Odysseus to value clever tactics over brute courage, embraced the new approach enthusiastically. But contingents from regions that celebrated individual heroism above all else struggled to master the formation's psychological demands. Meanwhile, inside Troy, Aeneas had begun his own investigation into countering the phalanx. He interviewed every survivor of the battle, gathering detailed observations about the Greek formation's movements, strengths, and vulnerabilities. He studied the terrain around Troy, looking for locations where maintaining shield wall cohesion would be difficult. He experimented with different weapon types, trying to find tools that could break the formation's integrity. His findings were both encouraging and deeply troubling. The phalanx's greatest strength is psychological, Aeneas reported to Priam's council. It's not that the formation is physically impenetrable. Individual soldiers in the wall can be killed. Shields can be broken, spears can be dodged or deflected, but the Greeks fight with absolute confidence that their formation will hold, and that confidence becomes self-fulfilling. Every man knows his brothers will stand firm, so he stands firm himself. Breaking the phalanx requires breaking that psychological cohesion, making individual soldiers doubt their neighbours, creating fear that the formation will collapse. He proposed several counter-tactics that Trojan commanders began preparing. First, use of massed archery against the phalanx from angles that made the overhead shield defence less effective. Second, cavalry strikes against the formation's flanks and rear, forcing it to defend in multiple directions and potentially creating gaps. Third, deployment of longer spears that could reach over the phalanx's front rank to strike rear ranks, disrupting the pushing force that gave the formation its momentum. Fourth, and most importantly, terrain selection, fighting only in locations where maintaining shield wall cohesion was physically difficult. The testing of these counter-tactics came sooner than either side anticipated. 3 weeks after the initial phalanx victory, a Greek foraging expedition of roughly 600 men, including 2 phalanx formations of 200 warriors each, plus support troops, ventured east toward the foothills to gather supplies from distant villages. Aeneas, monitoring Greek movements from Troy's walls, saw his opportunity. The terrain between Troy and the hills was crossed by several seasonal streams that had cut shallow ravines into the plain, creating uneven ground. If he could engage the Greek phalanxes in this broken terrain, their formation integrity would be compromised. Aeneas assembled a strike force of 1,000 carefully selected Trojan warriors, including 500 archers and 200 cavalry, the latter mounted on horses that had been carefully preserved behind Troy's walls throughout the siege. His plan was sophisticated, using multiple attack vectors simultaneously to exploit every weakness he'd identified. The archers would engage from the flanks, forcing the phalanxes to deploy their overhead shield defence. While the shields were raised, cavalry would charge from the rear, disrupting formation cohesion. Any Greeks who broke from the phalanx to counter the cavalry would be isolated and overwhelmed. Meanwhile, the rough terrain would make maintaining shield contact difficult, creating gaps that Trojan infantry could exploit. The Greek foraging party, confident after weeks of Greek victories and growing comfortable with their phalanx tactics, was moving carelessly through the broken ground when Aeneas sprung his trap. The Trojan archers appeared on both flanks simultaneously, roughly 200 yards distant, and began sustained fire at the Greek formations. The Greeks, responding as trained, formed their phalanxes and raised overhead shields, creating the bronze roof that had previously proven impervious to arrow fire. But Aeneas had anticipated this. The moment the Greek shields rose, blocking their forward vision and mobility, 200 Trojan cavalry emerged from concealment behind a low ridge and charged the rear of the Greek formation at full gallop. The horses, fresh and well fed from Troy's carefully managed supplies, covered the distance in seconds. The Greeks, hearing the thunder of approaching hooves but unable to see clearly from within their shield roof, tried to turn their formation to face the new threat. This was exactly what Aeneas had planned for. Turning a phalanx while maintaining formation integrity is one of the most difficult maneuvers in coordinated warfare. It requires every man to move in precise synchronization, maintaining shield contact while stepping sideways or backward, rotating the entire formation as a unit. On level ground with extensive training, it's challenging. On broken terrain crossed by ravines and stream beds, it's nearly impossible. As the Greek phalanxes attempted to rotate to face the cavalry charge, gaps opened in their shield walls. Men stumbled over uneven ground. Shield contact was broken. The formation's cohesion fractured. The Trojan cavalry struck the disordered Greek formations like a hammer hitting glass. Horsemen rode into the gaps that had opened in the shield walls, their longer reach from horseback allowing them to strike down at Greek soldiers who'd trained exclusively for close-quarters formation fighting. Greeks who broke from the phalanx to defend themselves individually were exactly what Aeneas wanted. Isolated warriors facing coordinated enemies, the opposite of the tactical advantage that had won the earlier battle. Simultaneously, Trojan heavy infantry charged from the front, targeting the sections of the Greek formation where cohesion had been lost. They didn't try to break through the intact portions of the shield wall, instead they poured into the gaps, widening breaches, isolating clusters of Greek soldiers from their formations. The coordinated, multi-directional attack achieved exactly what Aeneas had planned. Within minutes, the two Greek phalanxes had been shattered into isolated groups of warriors, fighting desperately without the formation advantages that had made them dominant. The Greeks fought with courage, but courage without tactical advantage leads to slaughter. The 600-man foraging party was systematically destroyed. Some Greeks tried to reform their phalanxes, but the broken terrain and constant pressure from multiple directions prevented re-establishing formation discipline. Others abandoned formation tactics entirely, reverting to individual combat, but this played directly into Trojan hands. By the time survivors began fleeing back toward the main Greek camp, over 400 Greeks lay dead, including both phalanx commanders and most of the veteran formation fighters. The few dozen Greeks who escaped brought devastating news to the main camp. The phalanx could be beaten. The Trojans had figured out how to counter the formation through coordinated combined arms tactics, terrain selection, and multi-directional attacks. The psychological impact on the Greek army was severe. The invincible formation that had seemed to guarantee victory suddenly looked vulnerable. Soldiers who'd trained for weeks in phalanx tactics now questioned whether they were learning a tactic that had already been rendered obsolete. Agamemnon convened an emergency council and the debate was fierce. Some commanders argued for abandoning phalanx tactics entirely, returning to traditional warfare. Others insisted the formation was still valid, but required refinement and better tactical deployment. Nestor, drawing on his vast experience, cut through the panic with ancient wisdom. Every tactic has counters, every formation has weaknesses. The phalanx isn't invincible, but neither is traditional combat. What we need is flexibility, the ability to employ different tactics for different situations, the wisdom to know when formation warfare is advantageous and when it's suicidal. Odysseus agreed and expanded on the strategic implications. Aeneas is smart, perhaps the smartest commander Troy has. He studied our formation, identified weaknesses, and developed specific counters. But his success yesterday doesn't invalidate the phalanx, it validates the importance of combined arms warfare and tactical flexibility. We need archers to suppress enemy missiles. We need cavalry to protect our flanks and rear. We need to choose engagement terrain carefully. And most importantly, we need to train our phalanxes to fight in multiple configurations, not just the single rigid formation we've been using. Over the following months, Greek tactical doctrine evolved rapidly. The simple phalanx of 8 ranks deep became multiple variations, deeper formations of 12 or 16 ranks for holding ground against overwhelming pressure, shallower formations of 4 ranks for greater mobility and flexibility, divided formations that could engage threats from multiple directions. Phalanxes trained to fight in coordination with cavalry and archers, creating combined arms battle groups rather than standalone formations. The Greeks were learning what would eventually become the fundamental principle of military tactics. No single formation or weapon system is universally superior. Victory comes from employing the right tools for the specific tactical situation. Troy, emboldened by Aeneas's victory, began launching more aggressive sorties from the city. Small raids targeted Greek supply lines, forcing the Greeks to deploy phalanx escorts for every foraging party and supply convoy. This stretched Greek manpower and created opportunities for Trojan forces to catch isolated Greek units in disadvantageous terrain. For several months, the tactical balance shifted back toward equilibrium, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. But the fundamental strategic reality hadn't changed. Troy was still besieged, still dependent on limited supplies, still unable to drive the Greeks away permanently, and the Greeks, despite tactical setbacks, were learning and adapting faster than the Trojans. The difference was organizational and cultural. The Greek army, composed of contingents from dozens of city-states with different military traditions, was rapidly synthesizing the best ideas from multiple sources. Spartan discipline combined with Athenian flexibility, Ithacan cleverness merged with Mycenaean heavy infantry power. This intellectual cross-pollination accelerated Greek tactical development. Troy, by contrast, had a more rigid military hierarchy and less diversity of tactical thought. Aeneas was brilliant, but he was essentially one innovative mind trying to counter an entire army of experimenters and innovators. Every Greek failure led to dozens of commanders independently developing solutions. Every Greek success was immediately analysed and incorporated across multiple contingents. The Greeks were effectively crowdsourcing tactical innovation, while Troy relied on centralised military planning. The turning point came during a battle that later Greek historians would call the Battle of the Twin Rivers, fought 6 months after the initial phalanx victory. A major Greek supply convoy, heavily laden with food and equipment shipped from the Greek mainland, was travelling from the coast to the main camp. The convoy was escorted by nearly 2,000 Greek warriors, including 6 phalanx formations, 400 cavalry, and 600 archers. It was the largest Greek force to venture far from the main camp since the siege began. Aeneas, recognizing this might be his last opportunity to strike a decisive blow before Troy's supplies ran critically low, assembled nearly 3,000 Trojan warriors for an ambush. He chose the terrain carefully, a valley where 2 seasonal streams converged, creating broken ground crossed by gullies and scattered with boulders, terrain where phalanx cohesion would be difficult to maintain. His plan was ambitious, to destroy the supply convoy and inflict such catastrophic losses that the Greek siege would collapse from demoralization and resource depletion. The ambush was sprung at dawn, with Trojan forces attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. Aeneas had learned from his earlier success that defeating phalanxes required preventing them from choosing their ground and forming up properly. His troops struck the Greek column while it was strung out along the valley floor, unable to deploy into optimal formation. The initial Trojan assault was devastatingly effective, catching Greek forward elements by surprise and inflicting heavy casualties before effective resistance could organize. But the Greek response demonstrated how much they'd learned in the months since their tactical doctrine began evolving. Instead of attempting to form single large phalanxes that would have been vulnerable in the broken terrain, Greek commanders immediately organized their forces into smaller, more flexible units. Each phalanx formation split into 2 separate shield walls, creating 12 independent formations of roughly 80 men each. These smaller units could maneuver more effectively in rough terrain, while still maintaining enough mass to execute coordinated tactics. Simultaneously, Greek cavalry moved to screen the flanks, engaging Trojan horsemen and preventing them from surrounding the column. Greek archers deployed on elevated positions, providing covering fire that disrupted Trojan infantry formations attempting to exploit their numerical advantage. The supply convoy itself, instead of being a vulnerability, became an asset. The wagons were quickly formed into a defensive perimeter, creating a fortified position where wounded could be evacuated and ammunition resupplied. The battle devolved into a brutal close-quarters fight that lasted nearly 5 hours, an eternity by the standards of Bronze Age warfare where engagements typically lasted minutes or hours at most. The smaller Greek phalanx formations proved remarkably effective, able to hold defensive positions against superior numbers while supporting each other through coordinated movement. When one formation was pressed hard, neighbouring units would wheel and strike the Trojans from the flank, then return to their original positions. The tactical flexibility was something Troy's more rigid command structure couldn't match. Aeneas, watching his carefully planned ambush degenerate into an attritional slugging match, made the critical mistake of committing his reserves too early. He threw his final 1,000 fresh warriors into the battle, attempting to overwhelm the Greek positions through sheer weight of numbers. The Greeks, having trained extensively in formation reinforcement and replacement procedures, simply cycled fresh fighters from the wagon perimeter into the front lines, while exhausted warriors pulled back to rest. The Greeks were treating the battle like a military operation with logistics and sustainability, rather than a glorious heroic engagement. By midday, Trojan casualties had reached unsustainable levels. Over 800 Trojans lay dead or too badly wounded to continue fighting. The Greek formations, battered but intact, still held their ground. Trojan warriors, exhausted from hours of continuous combat against enemies who seemed to have unlimited reinforcements, began withdrawing without orders. The disciplined Trojan retreat Aeneas tried to organize collapsed into a rout when Greek cavalry, held in reserve specifically for this moment, launched a pursuit that turned withdrawal into slaughter. The Greeks, having learned the dangers of breaking formation to pursue fleeing enemies, didn't make that mistake. The phalanx formations held their positions, securing the supply convoy and treating their wounded. Only the cavalry pursued, and they did so with tactical discipline, striking at the flanks and rear of the Trojan retreat, rather than charging recklessly into potential traps. By the time surviving Trojan forces reached the safety of Troy's walls, Aeneas had lost over 1,200 men, nearly 40% of the force he'd committed. The Greek losses were significant, roughly 500 casualties, but not catastrophic. More importantly, the supply convoy reached the Greek camp intact. The Battle of the Twin Rivers marked the psychological end of Troy's resistance. The city had gambled its best remaining troops on an ambush that should have succeeded, but had been defeated by superior Greek tactical flexibility and operational discipline. Inside Troy, the mood was despairing. Food supplies were critically low, the warrior class had been decimated, civilian morale was broken. King Priam, now ancient and exhausted by 10 years of war, could see no path to victory or even survival. In the Greek camp, the mood was triumphant but also reflective. The victory had been achieved not through the brilliance of individual champions, but through systematic application of combined arms tactics, flexible doctrine, and operational discipline. Agamemnon addressed his commanders after the battle with words that revealed how much Greek military thinking had evolved. We came to Troy as champions seeking glory through individual heroics. We learned to fight as phalanx formations, subordinating individual glory to collective victory. Now we've learned something even more important. Victory comes not from any single tactic, but from flexible application of multiple capabilities, from choosing the right tool for each situation, from systematic military operations rather than heroic gestures. This is how wars will be fought in the future. Odysseus, ever the strategist, saw broader implications. We've developed something Troy cannot match. Not just tactical superiority, but a system for generating tactical innovation. Every contingent in our army contributes ideas. Every battle teaches lessons that spread across our entire force. We're not just better warriors, we're a better military organization. That's what's going to win this war, not individual courage or even formation tactics, but our ability to learn and adapt faster than our enemies. The final assault on Troy came not as a climactic battle, but as an inevitable conclusion to strategic realities. With Troy's food exhausted, its warriors depleted, its will broken, the city had 3 choices: surrender, starvation, or a suicidal final stand. Priam chose surrender, negotiating terms that spared most of the civilian population, but required Troy's complete submission and the return of Helen to Menelaus. The Scaean gates that had remained defiantly closed for 10 years opened not in defeat through military assault but in acknowledgement of strategic impossibility. The Greek warriors who finally entered Troy found not the mighty fortress they'd imagined, but a starving city filled with desperate people who'd endured a decade of siege. Many Greek soldiers, expecting triumphant conquest, instead felt something closer to pity. These were the enemies who'd resisted the greatest military force assembled in the Bronze Age for 10 years, and their courage deserved respect even in defeat. But the military lessons of the Trojan War were clear and would shape warfare for centuries. Formation tactics, properly employed with combined arm support, could defeat traditional heroic combat. Tactical flexibility beat tactical rigidity. Organizational learning and systematic innovation trumped individual brilliance. Logistical sustainability determined strategic outcomes more than battlefield heroics. These were revolutionary concepts in the Bronze Age, but they became fundamental principles that every subsequent military force would have to master or perish. Stichius, the veteran Spartan who'd commanded the first phalanx formation, survived the war and returned to Sparta, where he devoted his remaining years to refining formation tactics and training new generations of warriors in disciplined combat. His teachings would form the foundation of Spartan military doctrine that would make them the most feared warriors in Greece for the next several centuries. The phalanx, tested and proven in Trojan blood, became the dominant tactical system of the classical Greek world. The veterans who returned from Troy carried more than physical scars. They carried knowledge that warfare had fundamentally changed, that the age of individual champions was ending, replaced by an era of disciplined formations and systematic military operations. Young men across Greece who heard their stories understood that glory would no longer come from individual heroics, in the manner of Achilles, but from collective achievement in the manner of the phalanx. This cultural shift from individual to collective military values would reshape Greek society and politics for generations. The Trojan War, remembered in later centuries primarily through Homer's poetry, focusing on individual heroes and divine intervention, was actually decided by the development and application of innovative tactical doctrines that replaced heroic combat with disciplined formation warfare. The day the Greek hoplites routed the Trojan defenders outside the Scaean gates was the day the Bronze Age learned that battles are won not by the bravest individual warriors, but by the most disciplined collective formations, not by seeking personal glory, but by trusting absolutely in the men fighting beside you, not by heroic gestures, but by systematic application of tactical principles. Troy fell not to the wooden horse of a legend, but to the unstoppable reality that disciplined formations backed by flexible doctrine and superior military organization will always eventually defeat rigid traditional tactics, no matter how courageously defended. The phalanx had spoken its first words on that April morning when 200 Greeks emerged from the Scamander Marsh and routed 800 Trojans through formation discipline. By the time Troy's gates finally opened in surrender 10 years later, the phalanx had written the entire vocabulary of a new age of warfare in the blood of two armies that had learned, adapted, and ultimately transformed how battles would be fought for the next 1,000 years.